Humanity's first interstellar voyage was meant to be a triumphant step into the stars. The Erebus, Earth's most advanced exploration vessel, had traveled beyond the Sol system, venturing into the unknown. For months, they had encountered only the vast emptiness of space. But then, without warning, their ship was caught in an energy net, a force field unlike anything seen before. Captain Elias Rains gripped the armrest of his chair as alarms blared. "Report," he barked. "Unknown energy signature, quadrant-wide containment field. We're being pulled in." Lieutenant Aria Vasquez shouted. The Erebus shuddered as a colossal structure materialized before them. It was no ship. It was a city in space, massive beyond comprehension, with towers of metal and glowing spires stretching for miles. Before anyone could react, a voice thundered through the comms, deep and resonant. "Your kind has trespassed into sovereign space. By decree of the Galactic Tribunal, you will surrender immediately." Seconds later, their ship was boarded. Towering figures in obsidian armor, bipedal but grotesquely elongated, marched onto the Erebus. Their glowing eyes radiated contempt as they seized the crew. Elias resisted, but the alien's sheer strength made struggle futile. Darkness followed. When Elias awoke, he was in a vast chamber, an alien coliseum, filled with thousands of beings from across the stars. They sat in tiered rows, their gazes fixed upon the humans. At the center stood a massive, ornate throne, where a figure of immense stature glowered down at them. "You are the first of your species to be captured," the alien leader declared, his voice booming. "You call yourselves humans. But we call you what you are, insignificant." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, amusement evident in the eyes of the tribunal's members. "You will serve, as all lesser beings do. Your species will be integrated as slaves into the rightful hierarchy." Elias clenched his fists. "We are not slaves. We are explorers." Laughter echoed through the chamber. The alien leader leaned forward. "Then prove it. If your kind possesses even a fraction of the strength you claim, you will fight for your freedom." A massive gate rumbled open. Two figures stepped out, hulking, armored warriors, their bodies enhanced with cybernetic augmentations. They wielded energy blades taller than any human. Elias looked at his crew, scientists, pilots, engineers. Not warriors. But if the galaxy expected them to kneel, they were in for a shock. The Colosseum buzzed with cruel anticipation as the cybernetic warriors stepped onto the battlefield. Their armor gleamed under the artificial lights, and their energy blades pulsed with a faint, menacing hum. The tribunal members watched with amusement, fully expecting a swift and brutal demonstration of humanity's inferiority. Captain Elias Rains took a slow breath. He wasn't a soldier, but he knew one truth: brute force could always be outmaneuvered. Lieutenant Aria Vasquez, a former Zero-G engineer, nudged him. "We don't stand a chance in a straight fight," she whispered. Elias smirked. "Good thing we don't fight fair." The deep voice of the tribunal leader boomed across the arena. "Your challenge is simple. Survive." A horn blared. The warriors charged. #### unconventional warfare. Elias barely dodged as one of the alien warriors swung its massive blade. The air sizzled where it passed, the heat alone searing the fabric of his uniform. The second warrior lunged for Vasquez, who rolled to the side, her mind racing. She spotted scattered debris on the arena floor, leftovers from previous executions. "Buy me time," she yelled. Elias turned to the alien towering before him. "Hey, ugly!" He threw a handful of sand from the ground into the warrior's face. The alien recoiled, roaring in anger as its optics scrambled to recalibrate. Meanwhile, Vasquez sprinted to a broken section of the arena wall and yanked out a loose power cable. Sparks flew as she twisted the exposed wiring. Elias kept moving, staying just out of reach. The warriors fought like they expected their opponents to stand still, to match strength with strength. They had no answer for unpredictability. Vasquez called out, "Clear the middle." Elias dove to the side as Vasquez jammed the exposed wire into a pool of spilled coolant. The liquid conducted the charge instantly, sending an electric shock straight into the warrior's augmented limbs. The smaller, more delicate circuits fried in an instant. One warrior seized up, its limbs locking rigid before it crashed to the ground, incapacitated. The crowd gasped. #### the psychology of defeat. The second warrior hesitated. No opponent had ever disabled one of their kind without brute force. Elias saw the doubt flicker in its stance. He grinned and stepped forward, deliberately casual. "What's wrong? Never fought someone who actually thinks?" The warrior snarled and swung, but its attack was slower now, more hesitant. It was no longer an executioner. It was prey, uncertain, afraid. Elias dodged and grabbed a discarded plasma baton from the arena floor. He struck the warrior's leg joint, where armor plating was thin. The warrior staggered. Vasquez retrieved a fallen energy blade. Though heavy, she used its weight against the alien, swinging low to force it off balance. With a final, calculated strike, they took the warrior down. The once mighty enforcer lay motionless. #### the shock heard across the stars. The silence in the Colosseum was deafening. Elias turned to the tribunal leader and spread his arms. "Still think we're weak?" The alien leader's expression was unreadable, but the murmurs in the crowd were growing. This was more than an upset. This was history being rewritten. The tribunal was no longer amused. "You have won," the leader admitted, voice tight with barely concealed rage. "But your fate remains unchanged." Elias and Vasquez exchanged a look. They had survived. But they were still prisoners. And they had just made themselves the most dangerous enemies in the galaxy. The grandeur of the alien arena faded into a sterile, metallic cell. The walls were smooth, unyielding, and adorned with strange runes that hummed with an eerie energy. Captain Elias Rains paced back and forth, frustration building with each step. They had won the trial, yet nothing had changed. Humanity was still imprisoned by the Galactic Tribunal. "They're not going to let us go," Aria Vasquez said, her voice sharp with the same frustration. She was sitting on the cold floor, fiddling with the interface of a discarded alien communicator they'd found earlier. "They'll just come up with another way to keep us in line." Elias stopped pacing. "We've beaten them once. We can do it again." "But how?" Aria asked, glancing up at him with a mix of skepticism and hope. "We're outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded by 100 different species who all want us dead or enslaved." Elias smiled grimly. "We're not out of options yet. The tribunal underestimated us once. They'll do it again." His words lingered in the air like a challenge. There had to be a way out, there had to be a way to escape their captors and prove once and for all that humanity was not a species to be dismissed. #### the plan begins. It was quiet in the cell block, the kind of quiet that only existed in places where prisoners were kept, where the air was thick with the weight of hopelessness. Elias and his crew had no illusions about their situation. The tribunal had no reason to release them, and they knew that a direct escape would be nearly impossible. But that didn't mean they were without hope. "I've been studying their security systems," Aria said, standing up suddenly. She had a spark in her eyes, the kind that told Elias she had found something. "There's a blind spot in their surveillance network. A short window when we could break out." Elias raised an eyebrow. "How short?" "Less than 5 minutes," Aria answered. "But if we can time it just right, I can get us to their lower levels. I've found a maintenance shaft, and from there, we can hijack one of their transport vessels." Elias' heart skipped. "How do we get past the guards?" Aria smirked. "I've been working on that too." She tapped her wrist, where a small, alien device was embedded, one that she had managed to reprogram after her previous escape. "We use their own tech against them. I'll create a diversion, scramble their comms, and we'll slip through the cracks." Elias nodded. It was a risky plan, but it was the only one they had. And for humanity, risks were nothing new. #### The escape begins. The countdown began. Aria's fingers danced across the communicator, carefully programming the sequence of events that would initiate the escape. 5 minutes, Elias muttered under his breath, eyes scanning the hallway outside their cell. The tension in the air was palpable. He could hear the faint thump of alien footsteps, routine patrols moving through the corridors. Nothing that seemed out of place. Yet. Aria's eyes flicked to Elias, her face a mask of concentration. "We need to move now." The sound of a distant alarm suddenly rang out, artificial and distorted, as Aria's reprogramming had triggered the security system's malfunction. The guards in the hallway panicked, their voices breaking up in confusion as their communications were scrambled. "Go! Now!" Elias shouted. They bolted from the cell, racing through the dimly lit halls. The entire station seemed to tremble with the rising chaos. Aria led the way, her hand flying over the control panels as she bypassed security doors with ease. The crew kept low, blending into the shadows of the vast complex, avoiding the larger patrols. Elias' heart pounded in his chest, but he focused on the mission, on the sheer will to escape. They couldn't afford to fail. As they approached the maintenance shaft, a new problem arose. 2 heavily armed guards stood just ahead. Elias raised a hand, signaling for the crew to halt. They couldn't afford to be seen now. Aria pulled out a small device, a piece of alien tech she had been fiddling with for days. With a quick press of a button, the guards' helmets flashed with bright, disorienting lights. They staggered back, momentarily blinded. "Now!" Elias barked. They rushed forward, taking the guards down with swift precision, knocking them unconscious before dragging them into an alcove. It wasn't pretty, but it was necessary. #### The final countdown. With the maintenance shaft ahead, their escape was nearly within reach. They scrambled up the narrow tunnel, the walls scraping against their shoulders. Aria led the way, scanning the area ahead for any signs of movement. At the end of the shaft, the faint hum of a transport ship could be heard, a low, thrumming sound that grew louder as they neared. The ship was their ticket out. It was a sleek, alien vessel, designed for high-speed travel, but it was guarded by a few sentries. "Just one more hurdle," Elias muttered. They would have to be quick. With a final surge of energy, they launched themselves at the ship, taking down the guards with careful precision. Aria accessed the ship's controls, her fingers dancing across the alien interface. And then, with a sudden jolt, the transport vessel lifted off, leaving the tribunal station behind. Elias exhaled in relief, the cold expanse of space ahead of them. They had escaped, against all odds. But their journey had only just begun. As the transport vessel surged through the cold expanse of space, the hum of the engines was the only sound that could be heard. Captain Elias Rains stood at the cockpit window, gazing out at the vast, dark void. They had escaped, barely, but their fight was far from over. Behind him, the crew worked quickly, securing their stolen vessel and patching up wounds from the daring escape. But it wasn't the physical damage that weighed heavily on Elias' mind. It was the knowledge that, even with their success, they were still a small, insignificant force in the grand scheme of the galaxy. The tribunal would not forget their defiance. "We need a plan," Aria Vasquez said, joining him at the window. "We can't just keep running. They'll track us down." Elias nodded. "I know. But we're not alone in this. There are others out there, people who've been oppressed for generations by the tribunal. It's time we gave them a reason to fight back." "We're just one ship," Aria pointed out. "One crew. What can we possibly do against an empire this vast?" Elias turned to her, determination in his eyes. "We're more than that. We're humanity. We have a power none of them can understand." The crew gathered around, sensing the shift in Elias' tone. He had always been a leader, but now, the fire in his eyes was something more. It was a spark of defiance, of rebellion. And he would not let it die. ### rallying the oppressed. The journey back to Earth was brief but filled with purpose. Elias sent encrypted signals to known rebel groups, outcasts, and civilizations that had long been subjugated by the tribunal. They all had one thing in common, a burning desire for freedom. The message was simple. The tribunal can be defeated. The time for rebellion is now. The response was overwhelming. From mining colonies on distant moons to secretive, oppressed species hiding on the fringes of galactic space, word spread quickly. Elias' message was not just a plea, it was a rallying cry. One by one, ships and colonies began to join their cause. They were small at first, uncoordinated and desperate, but with each new addition, the growing coalition became a force to be reckoned with. They called themselves the Sons and Daughters of Earth. They were not just fighting for their own freedom, but for the freedom of every species that had been crushed under the weight of the tribunal's rule. They were no longer just survivors, they were revolutionaries. Elias stood in front of a new makeshift war council, a holographic map of the galaxy projected before them. This isn't just a fight for survival anymore, he said, his voice steady but fierce. This is about rewriting the rules of the galaxy. We're not just going to resist the tribunal, we're going to bring them to their knees. Arya, now at his side, added, we've already shown them that we can win. Now, we need to hit them where it hurts. We strike their supply lines, we cut off their communication, and we make them fear us. There was no hesitation in the room. The crew, along with their new allies, knew what they had to do. It was a risk, but the alternative, living in servitude, forever beneath the thumb of the tribunal, was unthinkable. The first strike. The first target was a supply convoy carrying vital resources to the tribunal's fleet. The convoy was heavily guarded, but with the element of surprise, the Sons and Daughters of Earth launched a calculated, precise attack. They took the convoy down in a series of hit-and-run strikes, never staying in one place too long, always staying ahead of the enemy's retaliation. The enemy was stunned, unprepared for the audacity of their assailants. For the first time, the tribunal realized they were up against something they couldn't easily crush. We did it, one of the rebels said, a grin spreading across his face as he watched the wreckage of the supply convoy on the ship's screen. Elias felt a surge of pride, but he knew this was only the beginning. The attack was a message, a signal that humanity and its allies would not back down. The war for the galaxy had only just begun. ### an unexpected ally. As the days passed, more and more species began to pledge their allegiance to the rebellion. Among them was the Valkyr, a fierce and warlike species that had been enslaved by the tribunal for centuries. They had never once been allowed to leave their homeworld, and their warriors had been used as gladiators in the tribunal's bloodsport arenas. Their leader, General Caleth, was a towering figure with crimson skin and fierce black eyes. He had lost everything to the tribunal, the death of his family, his people's enslavement, his own dignity. Yet, despite all of it, he had never given up. "We've fought for our freedom before," General Caleth said, his voice deep and commanding. "But never with a leader like you, Elias Reigns. We will fight with you. For the galaxy. For all of us." Elias nodded. "Together, we'll show the tribunal that no one is beyond redemption. No one is beyond rebellion." The galaxy had just become a much more dangerous place for the tribunal. The Sons and Daughters of Earth were no longer just a rogue band of rebels, they were a growing force, a coalition of freedom fighters spanning across the galaxy. They had struck the first blow, and with each passing day, their numbers swelled. Every corner of space was now filled with whispers of rebellion, and the tribunal could no longer ignore the fire that was spreading. Captain Elias Reigns stood at the center of the War Council, his gaze steady as it scanned the holographic map of their operations. The war was taking shape, but it was far from easy. The tribunal's response had been swift and brutal, sending wave after wave of fleet reinforcements to quell the growing insurgency. Yet the rebels were learning, adapting, and using every trick they could to stay one step ahead. Arya Vasquez, her fingers tracing the map's surface, looked up. Their forces are concentrated in the inner quadrants, where their fleet is strongest. But their outer defenses? Those are still weak. That's where we need to hit them. Elias nodded. The outer rim was where most of the oppressed species lived, the mining colonies, the outcast races, the forgotten worlds. These were the places where the tribunal had bled its influence dry, controlling resources and exploiting entire populations for its own gain. But those worlds were also ripe for rebellion. They were desperate for freedom. We strike fast, and we strike hard, Elias said, his voice firm. We'll hit their supply depots, cripple their communication networks, and force them to spread their fleet thin. It's time we show them that they can't keep this war contained. The room fell silent. Every person around the table knew the risk of such a mission. The tribunal would not take these attacks lightly, and their retaliation would be brutal. But there was no choice. The rebellion had to keep pushing, or else they risked losing the momentum they had gained. #### the edge of desperation. The first target in their new strategy was a remote planet on the very edge of the galaxy, a forgotten world that had once been a major mining hub for the tribunal. Now, it was little more than a rusted skeleton of its former self, but the tribunal still used it as a base to extract valuable resources from nearby asteroids. Elias, Arya, and their growing fleet of ships approached the planet under the cover of darkness. The operation was daring, a sneak attack meant to catch the tribunal's forces off guard. If they could disable the planet's resource extraction facilities and sabotage the supply chains, it would deal a massive blow to the tribunal's war machine. But the planet wasn't as deserted as they had hoped. The tribunal had left a skeleton crew stationed there, and they were well armed. "We're going to need more than just stealth for this one," Arya muttered, scanning the surface for signs of activity. "We don't have the luxury of time," Elias replied, his jaw clenched. "Prepare for an all-out assault. We hit them hard, and we don't stop until the job is done." The rebel ships descended onto the planet's surface, their engines cutting through the still air like knives. The moment they touched down, chaos erupted. The tribunal's defenses retaliated with all their fury, laser turrets firing into the sky, fighter craft launching into the atmosphere. But the rebels were ready. They had studied the planet's topography and knew its weaknesses. Elias and his crew led the charge, a storm of gunfire and explosions lighting up the dark sky as they fought their way to the extraction sites. "Stay focused," Elias shouted over the comms as he ducked behind a crate, narrowly avoiding a plasma blast. "We get in, we get out. No one gets left behind." The battle raged, the sounds of blaster fire and screaming engines filling the air. Rebel fighters cut through the planet's defenses with precision, but the tribunal was no slouch. They were well trained and far more numerous than expected. Elias was pinned down, his team forced to hold their position as enemy reinforcements landed. The battle was shifting against them. Just as it seemed the rebels might be overrun, Arya's voice crackled over the comms. "We've got a chance," she shouted. "The central power core is exposed. If we can destroy it, we can take down their entire base." Without hesitation, Elias barked orders. "Move out. We hit the power core now. #### the heart of the beast." The team moved swiftly, weaving through the wreckage of the battlefield, their feet pounding against the cracked ground. They reached the central power core, an immense, sprawling structure guarded by a group of elite soldiers. It was a fierce battle. The rebels fought with everything they had, but the tribunal soldiers were relentless, each one determined to protect the power core at all costs. Elias found himself locked in a one-on-one fight with a tribunal commander, his blade clashing with the alien's massive energy sword. The commander was strong, his strikes brutal, but Elias was faster. With a final, decisive move, he disarmed the commander and sent him sprawling. "We're clear," Elias shouted, signaling to Arya. "Plant the charges." Arya didn't hesitate. She ran to the central core and quickly set the charges. Within moments, the countdown began. The crew fell back, retreating to the rebel transports, as the power core began to hum with deadly energy. With a deafening explosion, the base erupted in a massive blast. The shockwave sent the entire planet trembling, but the mission was a success. The Tribunal's grip on the outer rim was shattered. As the rebels flew off into space, Elias couldn't help but smile. This was just one victory, but it was a sign, one small step toward a galaxy free from the Tribunal's tyranny. The explosion that had leveled the Tribunal's base on the distant mining world reverberated through the galaxy, its shockwaves echoing in every corner where the Tribunal's influence had once been absolute. For the first time in decades, the vast empire was on the defensive. They had lost a key resource hub, and worse, their invincibility had been questioned. In the command center of their flagship, the Vigilance, High Commander Zoril, one of the Tribunal's most feared leaders, slammed his fist against the console. His face was twisted in a mask of fury. "Reinforcements are on the way," one of his officers reported, voice trembling slightly. "But the loss at the mining colony, it's catastrophic. They hit us where it hurts." Zoril narrowed his eyes. "They've awakened a storm they cannot control. Prepare to mobilize the fleet. We will make an example of these rebels." Meanwhile, the sons and daughters of Earth had become more than just a rebellious faction, they were now a symbol of hope. Across the galaxy, whispers of their victories had sparked uprisings on a dozen worlds, and every victory emboldened them. But Elias Reigns and his crew knew that their success had only intensified the Tribunal's resolve to destroy them. The coming battles would be harder, deadlier, and the stakes higher than ever. #gathering storms. Elias sat in the war room of their mobile flagship, the Resolute, staring at the holographic display of the galaxy before him. Their forces were growing, but so were the Tribunal's reprisals. What had started as a small skirmish was now an all-out war for the galaxy's future. Rebels were gathering from every corner of known space, some with starships, others with nothing but the will to fight. Arya stood by his side, her fingers tapping the surface of the table as she scrolled through the data reports. "They're amassing their fleet in the inner sectors," she said, her voice steady. "Their supply lines are intact, and they're bringing reinforcements from every system under their control." Elias sighed. "We're running out of time. We can't keep striking at the edges of their empire forever. We need to go for the heart." "Their capital?" Arya asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yes," Elias said. "It's the only way to show the galaxy we're serious. If we can strike at their heart, we cripple them. They'll be forced to spread themselves thin. The rest of the galaxy will see that they're vulnerable." "Do you know what you're asking, Elias?" Arya's voice softened, and there was a hint of hesitation in her words. "Their capital is a fortress. They won't fall easily. And if we fail..." "If we fail, we lose everything," Elias cut in. "We have to do this. We either break them now or give them the chance to destroy us before we even get close." He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of his crew, the same fierce, determined people who had risked everything to get this far. There was no turning back. "Then we're going to need a plan," Arya said, her fingers already flying over the controls. #the capital assault. The sons and daughters of Earth launched a full-scale attack on the Tribunal's capital world, Syraxer, a fortress planet heavily fortified with massive defenses. The city sprawled across the planet's surface like an ironclad beast, its towering structures bristling with weaponry. The skies were filled with anti-spacecraft fire, and every inch of the planet seemed to be shielded by layers of advanced technology. But Elias had studied the planet for months. He knew there was a way in, just one chance to strike. "We'll need to neutralize their orbital defenses before we can even think about landing," Arya said, her voice cold with calculation. The fleet had assembled near the planet's outer orbit, a cluster of ships that included rebel warships, repurposed civilian transports, and stolen Tribunal fighters. They were outnumbered, outgunned, but not outmatched. Their first target was the orbital defense ring, a massive system of satellites that protected the planet from any outside intrusion. The battle that followed was brutal. Waves of rebel ships broke through the enemy defenses with a coordinated, full-throttle attack. The air crackled with the roar of plasma blasts, the sky lit up in brilliant explosions as rebel ships sacrificed themselves to create openings in the defense grid. It was a gamble, but the rebels knew that if they didn't make it through, all was lost. With precise timing, Aria's team deployed a special team of engineers, slipping through the chaos to hack into the planetary defense system and disable the most powerful weaponry. The operation was chaotic, nothing went as planned, but that was the essence of rebellion. In the end, they succeeded, and the orbital defense grid fell silent. "We have a window!" Aria shouted over the comms. "Now or never. #### the siege of Syraxar." As the rebel fleet descended onto the planet's surface, they were met by the full force of the Tribunal's ground forces. Thousands of armored soldiers stormed the streets, backed by war mechs and heavy artillery. It was a battle of attrition, every inch of ground fiercely contested, but Elias led his team into the heart of the city. The streets were chaotic, filled with the sounds of combat and explosions as the rebels fought tooth and nail to breach the heart of the capital. But it wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a fight for freedom. "This is it," Elias said, his voice low. "We're going to take their command center. That's where we end this." They fought their way through the city's outer districts, where barricades and alien defenses slowed them down, but they pressed on. Time was running out. As they neared the command center, the full weight of the tribunals might descended on them. Elite soldiers, war mechs, and armored divisions were waiting, but the rebels fought with an intensity that even the tribunal couldn't match. And then, they breached the gates. Elias led the charge through the final corridor of the command center, where the high officials of the tribunal stood, awaiting their inevitable defeat. "This ends today," Elias said, as they stormed into the heart of the enemy's citadel. The command center of the tribunal was a place of cold efficiency, with walls made of sleek, dark metal and a labyrinth of consoles that controlled every corner of the galaxy. It was here, in this fortress of power, that the fate of the universe would be decided. The time for rebellion had come to its peak. Elias Reigns stood at the forefront of his crew, his pulse pounding in his ears as he stared at the towering figure of High Commander Zoral. The alien commander was a gargantuan presence, his eyes glowing with an unnatural, cold fury. He was clad in black armor, the emblem of the tribunal embossed on his chest. Behind him, a group of his most elite soldiers stood ready, weapons drawn, and their faces filled with the same ruthless determination that had made the tribunal's name feared across the galaxy. But there was something different now. The fear in Zoral's eyes, the tension in his posture, he knew the end was near. The rebels were no longer a nuisance to be wiped away, they were a force to be reckoned with. "This is where your rebellion ends," Zoral sneered, his voice a deep, menacing growl. "We've heard that before," Elias replied, his voice steady despite the chaos that raged outside the command center. The battle for the city was still ongoing, but they were close now, closer than ever to the heart of the tribunal's empire. Zoral's lips curled into a snarl. "You think you've won? You've merely delayed the inevitable. The tribunal will rebuild. Your war is nothing but a flickering candle in the wind." Elias stepped forward, unwavering. "Then you're too blind to see the truth. This war isn't just ours. It's for every soul the tribunal has crushed underfoot. And it's coming for you, whether you like it or not." The sound of blaster fire echoed from outside, growing louder. The rebellion had already breached the city's outer defenses, and the shockwaves of their advance were beginning to shake the very foundation of the command center. But Elias knew that the final blow would come from within. #### the final push. "Aria," Elias said quietly, his eyes locked onto Zoral's. "Now." Aria Vasquez, standing behind him, activated the command override with a single press of a button. The entire facility's security grid flickered and went offline, a sign that the rebels had succeeded in their final sabotage. The command center was now vulnerable. The ship's self-destruct countdown began, set to wipe the entire facility clean in under an hour. "Your empire is finished," Elias said. We've already won. Zoral's eyes widened in disbelief. You think you can win with this petty trick? You'll destroy yourselves along with us. But Elias wasn't listening. He had already made his decision. He wasn't fighting for personal glory or even just the survival of humanity, he was fighting for a future where all sentient beings had the right to live free from oppression. Zoral's empire had taken too much, crushed too many, and the galaxy had bled for far too long. The tribunal's reign was over. As the countdown continued, Elias motioned to his crew. We're done here. Let's move out. ### the last stand. As they made their way out of the command center, they were met by the full force of Zoral's elite soldiers. But the rebellion was unstoppable now. The soldiers who had once been fierce defenders of the tribunal faltered as they saw the truth in their enemies' eyes. The rebellion was a force of liberation, and it was too powerful to stop. One by one, Zoral's soldiers fell, their resistance breaking as the tide of battle shifted. The rebels, driven by their newfound strength, pushed forward relentlessly. Their will to win was ironclad, and nothing would stop them from seeing this victory through. With Zoral's soldiers defeated, Elias reached the final chamber, where the tribunal's last stronghold would fall. Zoral had one final weapon, his personal fleet of command ships, designed for ultimate destruction. But they were no match for the sheer force of the rebellion. In a brutal final confrontation, Elias and his crew managed to infiltrate Zoral's personal fleet, using their advanced tactics and ingenuity to destroy the last remnants of the tribunal's war machine. As the enemy ships were reduced to rubble, Zoral's last words echoed through the facility. You think you've won, but you've only set the stage for a new war. The tribunal's influence will never truly die. But Elias didn't flinch. His crew had already begun the process of dismantling every last bit of the tribunal's hold on the galaxy. They weren't just liberating humanity, they were liberating the galaxy. And no matter what Zoral said, the future was theirs now. ### a new dawn. With the fall of the tribunal, a new era began. Elias Reigns and the sons and daughters of Earth stood victorious, but they knew the true work was only just beginning. They would rebuild the shattered galaxy, one that would never again fall to tyranny. As the sun rose on a new day, both literal and figurative, Elias stood on the bridge of the Resolute, looking out at the vast, star-filled sky. The rebellion had won, but peace would take time. The galaxy needed to heal, to rebuild the trust that had been lost. There would be new challenges, new enemies to face, but humanity had proven something to the universe. They had proven that a determined few could defy even the most overwhelming odds. Humanity, and their allies, had shocked the galaxy. And now, they would lead it to a brighter future, one of hope, unity, and freedom for all. The revolution was not just an event, it was the beginning of a new chapter. And it was a chapter that no one could predict, except for one thing: humanity would always stand ready to fight for a better world. The future was theirs.